Iran struck near Israel's most sensitive nuclear site. Missiles landed, defenses failed. Now, one question is spreading across the world. Is this how a nuclear war begins? On March 21, 2026, the conflict reached a moment that immediately changed its trajectory. Ballistic missiles struck the cities of Dimona and nearby Arid, tearing into residential neighborhoods and leaving more than 100 civilians injured. Emergency sirens had sounded, defenses had activated, but several warheads still reached the ground, igniting fires, damaging homes, and sending shockwaves through communities that had only moments earlier been going about their daily routines. At first glance, the damage appeared localized. Civilian areas were hit, infrastructure was disrupted, emergency services moved quickly to contain the situation. But the true significance of the strike lay elsewhere. Dimona is not just another city. It is closely associated with Israel's most sensitive nuclear infrastructure, making any attack in its vicinity far more than a conventional military event. Even without a direct hit on the facility itself, the proximity alone carried enormous weight. This was a signal, not necessarily of immediate escalation into nuclear conflict, but of a willingness to operate closer to that boundary than ever before. The distinction between symbolic targeting and actual strategic impact began to narrow. The global reaction was immediate. Governments raised alert levels. Analysts debated the implications. Civilian fear spread alongside the uncertainty. Because in modern conflict, location can matter as much as destruction. And this strike, by where it landed, changed the stakes entirely. In the hours following the strike, one question dominated global attention. What, exactly, had been hit? Initial reports created a sense of alarm, with headlines suggesting that Dimona, long associated with Israel's nuclear infrastructure, had been directly targeted. But as assessments became clearer, a more precise picture began to emerge. The Negev Nuclear Research Center itself remained intact. Israeli authorities, alongside international monitoring bodies, confirmed that the facility had not been damaged. Radiation checks showed no abnormal levels, and operations continued without disruption. From a technical standpoint, the most feared outcome had been avoided. But the distinction between reality and perception proved critical. The missiles had struck nearby residential areas, not the nuclear site itself. Yet in a conflict where location carries symbolic weight, proximity alone was enough to trigger global concern. The difference between a direct hit and a near miss may be measured in meters, but the implications can span entire regions. Because the risk was never just about impact. It was about what could have happened. A slight change in trajectory, a different payload, or a failure in containment systems could have introduced the possibility of environmental contamination and far greater loss of life. Public reassurance followed quickly. Officials emphasized that safety protocols held, that the facility remained secure. But beneath that reassurance, a deeper concern remained unresolved. If a strike could come this close once, the margin for error in the future may be even smaller. As the missiles approached, Israel's air defense network moved into full activation. Radar systems tracked incoming trajectories, interceptor batteries launched in rapid succession, and command centers worked to calculate engagement points in real time. The system responded exactly as it was designed to. But not every threat was stopped. Several missiles penetrated the defensive layers and struck populated areas, raising immediate questions about how such a breach had occurred. Early assessments pointed to a key factor: the use of cluster munitions. These warheads changed the rules of interception. Even when the main missile body is successfully targeted, the payload can still separate mid-air, releasing multiple submunitions that continue descending independently. In effect, a single interception does not always neutralize the entire threat. The result is a paradox. A technically successful defense can still produce damage on the ground. This exposes a fundamental limitation in modern missile defense systems. They are optimized to intercept defined, high-speed targets following predictable paths. But once those targets fragment into dozens of smaller objects, the defensive advantage begins to erode rapidly. tracking becomes more complex, reaction time disappears, and the number of incoming threats multiplies instantly. For military planners, the implications are serious. If such tactics become more frequent, they could steadily reduce the effectiveness of even the most advanced defense networks, turning each engagement into a test not just of technology, but of endurance. For decades, Israel has maintained a policy that is as deliberate as it is ambiguous. It neither confirms nor denies the existence of its nuclear capabilities. This approach, often referred to as strategic ambiguity, has allowed Israel to project deterrence without openly declaring its position. The assumption of capability exists, but without formal acknowledgement, leaving room for flexibility in both diplomacy and military planning. But the strike near Dimona has brought that quiet policy back into the spotlight. Suddenly, a location long associated with Israel's nuclear infrastructure is no longer just a subject of speculation. It is part of an active conflict zone. Even without direct damage, the proximity of the attack has forced analysts, governments, and media outlets to revisit long-standing assumptions. The conversation has shifted, not toward immediate nuclear response, but toward nuclear signaling. Because in modern conflict, nuclear capabilities do not need to be used to have an effect. Their presence alone influences decision-making, shapes escalation thresholds, and alters how actions are interpreted on the global stage. Dimona now carries a different meaning. It is no longer just a facility, it is a symbol of deterrence, of vulnerability, and of the thin line between conventional warfare and something far more consequential. And as speculation grows, so does the pressure on every decision that follows. Because once nuclear dimensions enter the conversation, even indirectly, the stakes change for everyone involved. In the wake of the strike, one term began to reappear in strategic discussions: the Samson option. Often described as a last resort doctrine, it refers to the theoretical possibility that Israel could resort to nuclear weapons if its survival were ever placed in immediate danger. The concept is rooted in deterrence, a signal that, under extreme conditions, escalation could reach its highest level. But it is important to separate theory from reality. The Samson option has never been publicly confirmed as official policy. It exists more as a strategic concept than an operational plan, discussed in analysis, referenced in speculation, but never openly adopted. And in the current situation, there is no indication that such a scenario is being considered. Israel's response remains firmly within the bounds of conventional warfare. Military operations continue to focus on targeted strikes against infrastructure and strategic assets, aiming to degrade capabilities without crossing into nuclear escalation. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's messaging reflects that approach. Statements emphasize persistence, coordination across multiple fronts, and the continuation of military pressure, without signaling any shift toward extreme measures. The distinction matters, because while the Samson option captures attention, it represents a scenario, one tied to existential conditions, not to the current phase of conflict. For now, it remains what it has always been: a concept shaped by deterrence, not a policy in motion. In the aftermath of the strike, the international response was swift and cautious. Calls for restraint echoed across diplomatic channels as governments recognized the significance of what had just occurred. A strike near one of the most sensitive locations in the region had pushed the conflict into unfamiliar territory, where miscalculation carries far greater consequences. The risk is no longer contained. What began as a series of exchanges now holds the potential to expand into a broader regional confrontation. Multiple actors are already involved, and each new development increases the likelihood that others could be drawn in, either by alliance, necessity, or escalation. The United States now faces a complex strategic position. Balancing support, deterrence, and stability requires careful calibration. Reports suggest efforts are underway to manage the situation, from reinforcing defensive postures to ensuring that sensitive infrastructure remains secure. But even with those measures, control is not guaranteed. Because the conflict is no longer following a predictable path, It now sits at a fragile balance point. Each response invites another. Each action raises the stakes slightly higher. And with every step, the margin for de-escalation becomes narrower. This is the moment where decisions matter most, not just on the battlefield, but in the spaces between actions, where restraint, timing, and judgment can determine what comes next. And the central question remains unanswered. How far can this go before it becomes something far more difficult to contain?